Welcome everyone. Darkizer here with the latest in my series of Space Engineers tutorial videos. Recently, one of the questions that came up on the forum is different ways that you can facilitate grinding up other ships. Now, for those of you that play survival, I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of, you build your ships and you have fun and you make things. You eventually get to the point where you outgrow your current ship, your utility ships, your current base, your current space station, whatever you may have, and not wanting to waste resources, you basically wind up cutting the thing up and either modifying it or just rendering it down completely and starting from scratch. Happens all the time. It's one of the great parts about the game. However, there are several different ways that you can go about this. Some ships are small enough that you can grind them by hand, or if you're modifying a ship that already exists, sometimes working by hand is the best way to go. But once you get to the point where you have either a large number of players perhaps on your server, and all of them are welding and grinding and working on things all at the same time, or if you start to get into freighter capture and you start getting successful with that, you may eventually wind up with more ships than you can grind up in a reasonable amount of time. And that's the point where you may want to consider upgrading your apparatus. With that in mind, let's go ahead and we can show you a couple of different ways that you can go about this. Now, most of this is designed on your basic easy start platform. And this you may recognize as the area where they normally will start you off with the large landing gear that I presume that they intend for you to use for landing and docking your own ships. Landing gear being what they are currently, I wouldn't advise it. The results could be catastrophic. What I've done is I've modified this into a grinding pit. We have 16 grinders, as you can see. I have them stacked on the different sides, and then we have a row of collectors going down through the center. I also have some light armor blocks going around. I have them sloping inward, and all of this is working under gravity. So components and ore and loose things that happen to be floating around are much more likely to go into the pit than they are to stray out of it. The collectors are at the bottom in case you're grinding up something that happens to have some sort of cargo or other things that don't necessarily work with ship grinders. The idea is for that to go down into the collectors, and then of course the entire thing is rigged underneath to go into a cargo container and then up into the assembler and on to the rest of your system. I have most of this set up in such a way that it works off of a single button because I like to keep things simple. Hit the button, the grinders are working. Now this is presumably a ship that I no longer want for whatever reason. And the easiest way to do this is you turn off your inertia dampeners. You start your ship moving forward, you go ahead and you bail out. And your ship will drift down. I probably imparted just a little bit more velocity to that than I should have. And it hits the grinders. And the grinders start to do their job and the ship starts getting ground up. Unfortunately, unless you have your aft thrusters working, and you can set those to overload so that they're always generating a small amount of constant thrust, your ship will eventually get to the point where the area that is in contact with the grinders is ground away and everything stops. Now you can go through the effort of turning the grinders off and you can push this down by hand. It is a small ship and the inertia dampeners are off, so I should be able to push this with my suit. I don't advise it. It's not terribly safe. What I have done is I have modified a similar ship with some pistons, and I know I hear you crying about how risky pistons are, but as you can see, I never plan on having them connected to anything else. I have these connected to the infamous Spaceballs because they make great bumpers. And so now we're going to climb in here, and let me get my HUD back on. I have a camera. I do not have the clear camera mod. Oh well, this should be good enough. Now we move in close to our ship, and rather than actually bump everything with my ship, what I prefer is to use pistons to push things because I have more control over it that way. I'm less likely to have my ship drifting into things. The drawback to that being, of course, that the pistons may be strong enough to push my ship backwards. I have modified this ship specifically to act as a pushing ship. I have a lot of additional thrusters on the back, which is why you can see every time I start to thrust forward, I go into overload. But it works. It's imperfect, but it works. And again, I have 3 pistons. You can't see the third one. I have that located on the bottom. Ship is apparently stuck on the Spaceballs. And again, you go ahead and you press the ship in. The grinders take care of everything. You may occasionally have a piece of ship or something that does not fall into the area of the grinders, and at that point you may have to turn your grinders off and you may have to go in and clean things out by hand. That happens. It's not a big deal. And this works for the small scale. It works for small ships, nothing terribly large. This is quite we're getting into the realm of the ridiculous here because I have 3 different tiers of grinders. Again, I have them set up in such a way that if things were to hit the edge but they're traveling in a downward angle, they are more likely to tumble across into another grinder than they are to tumble out and make a mess. I have way too many conveyors on this particular setup, and I'm sure that it could be done in a much more efficient system. This is just for the purposes of our demonstration. We go ahead, we turn everything on, and again we fly into our erstwhile respawn ship. That's assuming that I can get in through the door. We have everything lined up pretty well. Square things up just a little bit. Again, we turn off our inertia dampeners. We thrust downward towards the grinders. And then we bail out. Again, I'm here in creative mode, so I don't have to worry. But in creative mode, you're not probably going to be grinding things up anyway. And again, we have things that you start to drift in, and then things start to make contact, and then they stop. And at that point, we run and fetch our little pusher ship, and we go ahead and we shove everything in. Now you can do this from first person, you can do this from third person, however you prefer to do things. In my particular case, I tend to do things from third person because my eyesight is not so good. My perspective on things tends to be a little bit wonky at times. Now see, for instance, the ship is right at the edge of the pit here, so I'm very glad that I had this third row of grinders set up. And when we get to the point where one end starts to get a little bit hung up, sometimes you have to go feed in the other end. And that's perfectly understandable. And again, the idea being that you want to try to prevent what's going on here, which is a little bit of a roll. Or if you're going to have the ship rolling, you want to have it rolling more towards the center of your pit. So we're going to jockey things around a little bit here so we can push things a little bit more towards the interior. And of course, I think I have my, for the purposes of the video, I think I have my grinding speed turned all the way up here. And the reason I have the pistons and the Spaceballs on the end of the whole thing is, of course, that way if it turns out that I do overextend myself a little bit, I get a little bit too close to the business end of things, then I wind up losing a piston or a Spaceball, or possibly both, as opposed to losing the nose of my ship, my cockpit, possibly even my pilot. One of the benefits to using grinders in this fashion is the fact that you can hook everything up. each grinder has quite a capacity for storing material. So even if you get to the point where your cargo bays start to get a little full, the grinders themselves can actually hold quite a bit of material. So this many grinders would hold just a tremendous amount of material. So you wouldn't necessarily have to worry if your cargo bay starts to fill up a little bit, or your refinery or your assembler start to fill up a little bit. You've got so much cargo capacity here in the grinders themselves. It's not really likely to be a problem. Now, as with all things in Space Engineers, you can get to the point where things can become a little silly. And a lot of that has to do with the fact, let me go and shut this thing off before I wind up killing myself. A lot of this has to do with the fact that unless you have some sort of catastrophic failure, once you start building things, you almost always wind up building larger and larger things. Now here we have our tried and true blue ship. This is the same thing that you find in the couple of the easy start scenarios. I'm pretty sure that you can probably wind up capturing one of these as a freighter or something like that, despite all of the guns on it. I've set this up in a system that I used when I first started playing survival. I got lucky early on in the game, before freighters started to recognize us as enemies and shoot at us. I actually managed to catch one of the large military transport ships, the big chunky ones with all of the heavy armor plate all over the place. And at that time, my utility ship was very small. It had one or two grinders on the front of it, and it literally took me weeks. It took me about 3 weeks of play at several hours a day grinding on this thing in order to grind it up, and so I could utilize all of the components. I had no use for the thing. It didn't have enough uranium in it to move, and I needed the steel plate. So rather than continue mining, I went ahead and I started cutting the ship up, and once I got done with it, I never needed to mine for anything ever again. Now this grinding pit should probably be a little bit wider. I made it a little bit narrow, but for the purposes of the exercise, I think this will work. What I have done is I have set up what amounts to a bandsaw, which is designed to cut the ship into sections that will fit in the grinding pit. So what we do is we have, I believe our grinding pit is already on. We turn on the grinders on the bandsaw. Get a little bit better perspective here. I already have the rotor set up. The rotor moves at the slowest speed that I can get it set up. And I'm using an advanced rotor, which is stuck on the advanced rotor here in the lower left-hand corner. It's stuck onto a conveyor so that anything that goes through the row of conveyors, through the grinders, goes down into the conveyors, and then it goes down into whatever cargo storage unit that I'm using. And I have this set up this slowly so that I have more control. You may be quicker on the trigger than I am, which means that you may be able to set this quite a bit faster. That's entirely up to you. Your mileage may vary. The idea being that when I first bring the grinders down in contact with the ship, I then stop the rotation on the advanced rotor, so that rather than shoving the ship down into the grinding pit, I'm actually just slicing through it. You can go ahead and you can leave, you can let the bandsaw go, and it will start to push the ship down into the grinders, which may or may not be more effective for you. I tend to find that starts to get a little bit messy, because now the ship starts to yaw, the ship starts to twist out of line, other things might start to get cut off, and now all of a sudden you may have components that explode and start flying around. If I happen to cut through the edge of a cargo container, because I shove the edge of a cargo container down into the grinding pit, if the cargo container has cargo in it and it pops, well, then I'm liable to have cargo scattered all over outside my grinding pit. And as I said, this one is quite a bit narrower than it should be. But the idea is that and let me swing around to give you a better perspective. The idea is that I swing right past my ship there. the bandsaw is set up in such a way that, and you can actually see from here how it works, I'm going to be slicing the end off of the ship just enough so that it will fit into the grinding pit, and then I'll come over with my tug or my pushing ship, and I'll shove that piece down into the pit. And then all I need to do is move the ship forward a little. I'll raise the arm up, and then I'll move the ship forward a little, and we'll do the same thing. We'll just start going ahead, and again, if my grinding pit were wider, then this would go quite a bit faster. I would have to make fewer slices. But this is one of the more efficient ways I know of to go ahead and start chopping up ships. Once you start catching ships, you start getting access to a tremendous amount of resources without going through all of the process of mining and refining and so on and so forth. So once you start catching things, once you start having surplus things to cut up, since there is no loss, unless you have something explode and drift off into space, since there is no loss from building things and then cutting them apart, once you start building things once, then it starts to get much more efficient. Well, I hope that this has been informative and entertaining. As always, I have links at the end of the video to my other Space Engineers tutorial videos, and likes are always appreciated, subscriptions doubly so. I have to have a caveat here. I am in a single player map. I have absolutely no idea if the bandsaw on my last rig would work on a multiplayer map. It may be stable enough because it's fastened to a platform that it may not be an issue. I don't know. If you have any specific questions, anything specific that you would like to see demonstrated, or anything that you would like me to try to make as a demonstration for you, please go ahead and either send me a message or leave it in the comments below. I hope to see you all in the game. Thank you very much for watching. This is Darkizer, and have a good night.